The museum was quiet, the kind of silence that settles between old steel and older memories. Outside, families posed for photos beside vintage tanks. But inside, under a muted skylight, a man in his late 80s stood still, his eyes locked on the long black barrel of the M2 Browning heavy machine gun. He wasn't reading the plaque. He already knew everything it said. The numbers, the designation, the wars, it was all part of him now. What he saw wasn't a display. What he saw was fire. To the teenage boy standing beside him, it was just another relic. He looked up at the old man with a curious expression. "Did you ever fire one of these, sir?" The man smiled faintly. His voice was rough with age, but steady. "Not just fired it, son. Lived with it, slept next to it, lost friends underneath it." He took a step closer to the weapon. His hand didn't touch the cold metal, but hovered just an inch above it, as if afraid it might still burn him. "That thing," he said, "they called it the Mother Deuce. And for good reason. She was loud, angry, and when she spoke everyone listened, even the Germans. You wouldn't know it now, but that man had once been Sergeant William Bill Morgan, U.S. Army, 1st Infantry Division, just 20 years old when he first heard the growl of that 50 caliber thunder in North Africa. Back then, it wasn't a relic. It was his right arm, his shield. His voice on the battlefield. He didn't become a legend. He didn't win a medal, but he survived, and survival, in a war like that, was often the most heroic thing a man could do. What made the M2 Browning more than just a gun? Why did German soldiers fear it more than tanks, more than mortars, more than the dreaded flamethrower? What was it about this brutal, raw piece of American engineering that turned it into a myth whispered on both sides of the line? To understand that, you'd have to go back before the beaches of Normandy, before the hedgerows of France, before the jungles of the Pacific. You'd have to go to the very beginning when a nation prepared for a new kind of war, and a man named Browning was handed a challenge no one had solved before. But this isn't just the story of a weapon. No. This is about the men who carried it, who fought beside it, who depended on it, and died within arm's reach of it. It's about the terrible power it brought to the battlefield, and the even greater weight it left on the souls who survived. And if you were in Bill Morgan's boots, behind that steel beast on the back of a Sherman tank, when the air was filled with smoke and the sound of metal tearing through metal, you might have asked yourself a question. Would you pull the trigger? It started with a problem no one could yet solve. The First World War had changed everything. The machine gun, once a mechanical curiosity, had become the reaper of men. But by 1918, it was clear that the battlefield was evolving even faster than the weapons meant to dominate it. Tanks, crude and slow as they were, had rolled across the trenches of Europe like iron monsters. Aircraft, barely more than fabric and wire, had begun dueling in the skies. And suddenly, the humble, 30 caliber round standard for rifles and machine guns alike wasn't enough. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, had seen this shift firsthand. He had watched bullets bounce off tank armor. He had seen observation planes take dozens of hits and keep flying. What he demanded next wasn't just a new gun, it was an entirely new class of firepower. The request was deceptively simple: a machine gun that could fire a half-inch round at over 2,700 feet per second, something powerful enough to punch through armored steel, something that could stop a plane mid-flight or shred a vehicle into scrap. The man chosen to make that happen was already a legend. John Moses Browning didn't look like a revolutionary. He was quiet, deeply religious, almost shy in person. But when it came to firearms, he saw what others couldn't. He didn't just build weapons, he designed ideas that changed how wars were fought. So when the army came calling, Browning got to work. His solution was both elegant and monstrous. He took his existing M1917 30 caliber water-cooled machine gun, already proven in World War I, and scaled it up. Everything got bigger: the receiver, the barrel, the operating system, and most importantly, the cartridge. The 50 BMG Browning machine gun was more than just a bullet. It was a statement. It measured 12, 7x99 mm, dwarfing the standard, 30-06. Each round carried over 5 times the energy of a rifle shot. When it hit, it didn't just wound, it obliterated. The early prototype, the M1921, was a beast. Water-cooled, heavy as hell, and awkward to mount. But it worked, it roared, it spat fire and steel. And it terrified those on the wrong end. Still, the army wasn't quite sure what to do with it. The M1921 weighed over 120 pounds without ammo. Add the tripod and water system, and you had a stationary weapon that couldn't move with infantry. Aircraft of the time couldn't handle the recoil. Tanks couldn't feed it properly. It seemed like the 50 calories was too powerful for its own good. But behind the scenes, improvements were coming. Browning, even as he aged into his final years, remained relentless. He modified the design, changed the feed system to allow both left and right side loading, introduced air-cooled barrels for aircraft and lighter field use. He made the system modular, adaptable, and field-ready. In 1926, just months before he died, John Browning finished the final modifications. And with that, the M2 was born. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't even widely accepted at first. But it had one thing that would change everything: reliability. The M2 could take sand, rain, snow, mud, and still fire. Day after day, year after year. Decades later, soldiers would still be using the same core mechanism, barely changed since Browning first drew it by hand. But this weapon needed a name. Soldiers don't often speak in designations, so they gave it something rougher, more honest. Ma Deuce, short for Mother Deuce. Part curse word, part affection, part fear. The nickname captured it perfectly. The M2 was loud, violent, unapologetically American. It didn't whisper like the German MG-34. It barked, kicked, and tore holes through steel. Those who fired it called it a gift. Those who faced it called it something else entirely. By the late 1930 seconds, while other countries turned to 20 mm or 30 mm cannons, America doubled down. The 50 BMG was smaller, yes, but it was faster, more versatile, and could be mounted anywhere on trucks, tanks, bombers, even on boats. It was the gun you could trust in a storm, in the mud, on a beach, in the sky. And soon enough, the world would see exactly what it could do. But back then, back before D-Day, before North Africa, before the jungles of the Pacific, it was still just a tool waiting for a war. A storm waiting for a battlefield. And somewhere, in a barracks in North Carolina, a young man named Bill Morgan was about to meet his new assignment. He didn't know it yet, but that heavy machine gun would become his closest companion, his protector, his burden. His mother on the battlefield. Bill Morgan was not born a soldier. He was born on a dirt road outside Asheville, North Carolina, to a family of mechanics and preachers. His hands knew grease before they knew steel. He grew up chasing dogs through cornfields, listening to his father hum hymns while fixing tractors, and thinking the world was small and good and understandable. But the world had other plans. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Bill was just 19. He was tall, wiry, with a quiet jaw, and eyes that stayed steady even when everything else wasn't. He signed up the week after. Not for glory, not even for revenge, just because it felt wrong to stay behind. Boot camp was mud, sweat, and repetition. March here, shoot there, scrub floors, clean rifles, get yelled at, do it again. And then one morning, while the frost still clung to the barracks roof, a gruff sergeant with a clipboard barked out names and assignments. Morgan, gunner, heavy weapons, line 2. He didn't even know what that meant at the time. Line 2 was where they kept the big stuff. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun lay there like a sleeping bear. 2 crates of linked ammo sat beside it, dull brass glinting in the pale sun. Most recruits looked at it like it might bite them. Bill didn't flinch. Maybe it was all those years with engines and pistons. Maybe he just recognized something in it, something dangerous but honest. This your baby now, the sergeant said. "Get to know her. She's going to bark louder than anything else on the field, and if you treat her right, she'll save your life more times than you'll know." Bill wasn't alone. Every M2 needed a team. That's when he met Jimmy Wells. Jimmy was barely 18, skinny as a rail, with sandy blonde hair and the kind of grin that looked like it belonged on a baseball card. He talked fast, laughed louder, and had a habit of singing country tunes off-key when he cleaned ammo belts. He'd been assigned as Bill's assistant gunner, which really meant ammo mule, loader, belt fixer, and occasional shield when the shooting started, but the two got along fast. Jimmy made jokes. Bill made sure they didn't get killed. They spent weeks training together, setting up the M2 on rocky hills, learning how to clear jams in seconds, how to swap barrels when they overheated, how to keep the tripod steady under fire. The weapon itself weighed nearly 84 pounds air-cooled, and the tripod another 44. Add belts of ammunition, and you were carrying the weight of a man, maybe two. But when it fired, it didn't matter how heavy it was. The ground would shake, the air would tear. That distinctive low, thudding roar, not the sharp crack of rifles, but something deeper, more final, like thunder after lightning. And Bill, he felt it in his chest, always in his chest. It was power, yes, but also responsibility. That much force could destroy anything in its path. A mistake meant more than a missed shot. It meant a death you'd have to live with. One night, after a long training op, they sat by a dying fire, passing a dented canteen between them. "You ever think about what this thing does to people?" Jimmy asked, nodding toward the M2 resting beside their tent. Bill didn't answer right away. "I think about what it protects," he said finally. "Us. The guys next to us. People back home." Jimmy nodded. "Yeah, I just hope it never turns on us." It was a strange thing to say. At the time, Bill didn't understand it, but he remembered it like a pebble dropped into a deep well. You don't hear the splash right away, but it's coming. By the end of training, they could set up the gun in 30 seconds flat, reload in 10, and hit a target 2,000 yards away with no more than a glint of sun off steel. The instructors called them naturals. Bill called it muscle memory, built on sleepless nights. When orders finally came down North Africa, they packed their gear in silence. No one cheered, no one clapped. War wasn't a parade. It was a question mark. As they boarded the ship, Jimmy leaned over and whispered, "You think Ma Deuce is ready?" Bill just looked at him, one hand resting on the gun case like it was a living thing. "She better be," he said. He didn't know then how often he would pray to that weapon, how many times he would shout into its roar, how often he would curse its weight, its heat, its smoke, or how much blood would be spilled around it. But he knew this much. He was the gunner now, and the gunner doesn't get to hesitate. North Africa didn't smell like home. It smelled like dust and oil, sunburned leather, gun grease, and the slow rot of rations left too long in heat. The desert wind cut through the open plains like a blade, stinging the eyes, filling your mouth with grit. It wasn't the war Bill Morgan had imagined, but then again, war never looked like the posters. The 1st Infantry Division had landed near Oran, and by February 1943, they were pushing inland toward the rocky ridges and jagged ravines of Tunisia. The Germans were waiting. The first time Bill saw the enemy, they didn't look like monsters. They looked like dots on a hill, silhouettes behind sandbags, rifles poking through shattered stone. Then the bullets started. Crack, 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 fast, precise, terrifying. "Ambush! Front ridge!" someone shouted. Bill didn't need orders. He dropped to one knee beside the half-track, and Jimmy was already feeding the belt into the M2. The gun was mounted high, swaying slightly on its pintle like a beast sniffing the air. The desert exploded around them. Dirt kicked up in clouds. A shell burst just ahead, flinging a soldier backwards like a rag doll. Bill swung the barrel toward the ridgeline and squeezed the butterfly triggers. The M2 roared. It wasn't a stutter or a snarl. It was a deep, rhythmic hammer, chewing the air in long, angry bursts. Each shot sent a shockwave through his arms, down his spine, into the earth. The tracers lit up like angry comets, streaking across the open sky. He aimed above the ridge at first, then walked the rounds down, slicing through sandbags, shattering cover, snapping limbs from scrub trees like twigs. The enemy fire slowed. Then it stopped. Silence. Not peace. Just that terrible pause after violence when no one moves because they're waiting to see who's still alive. Jimmy leaned close, breath ragged. Jesus, did you see what that did? Bill didn't answer. He saw. He saw the wall cave in. He saw helmets fly off. He saw briefly an arm, detached and flopping like meat in a butcher's stall. He had read about what 50 BMG rounds could do, but reading wasn't the same as watching it happen through the trembling sights of the Ma Deuce. And across the ravine, hidden behind a burned-out truck, a German lieutenant watched it all unfold. Franz Klein had served in France, in Poland, in the Russian snow. He'd seen tanks melt under Soviet fire. He'd seen comrades swallowed by Stuka bombs. But this was different. He had watched his men die in seconds. Walls didn't protect them. Trenches didn't slow the rounds. The American weapon punched through everything. Not with precision, with brutality. Klein had studied Allied weaponry, the M1 Garand, the BAR. He knew their limits, knew how to counter them. But this monster they'd mounted on their jeeps and trucks? He didn't even know the designation yet. He only knew the sound. Boom, 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 boom. Not fast like the MG-34. Not whispering like the MP-40. It was slow. Final. A judge-passing sentence. Klein ducked as the gun roared again. Another burst. The boulder beside him cracked. He turned to his radio operator. Pull back. Mark their flank. We'll hit them later with mortars. Not now. The operator nodded, eyes wide. As the Germans withdrew, Bill's squad advanced slowly, cautiously. No cheers, no triumphant charge. Just movement, guns up, breath held. The bodies came into view. Bill tried not to look, but you always do. One man had no chest left. Another had a leg that wasn't connected anymore. The sandbags had been reduced to confetti. Blood had painted the rocks in wide, dark splashes. Someone muttered, "Hell of a gun." Bill set the safety and stepped away, hands shaking slightly. Jimmy handed him a canteen, but he didn't drink. He stared at the M2, still smoking, barrel warm. And then he said something low. Not to Jimmy. Not to anyone, really. Just to the gun. "What the hell are you?" That night, the men dug in behind a rocky ledge. The M2 was cleaned, cooled, covered with a tarp. Jimmy sat beside Bill, twirling a spent casing between his fingers. "You okay?" Bill nodded. "Just thinking." "About the guys we just smoked?" "Yeah. They would have killed us." "I know." Jimmy was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think I get it now. Why they call it Mother Deuce." Bill glanced at him. "She's not nice, not pretty, but when the world's on fire, she's the only one yelling loud enough to push back." Bill didn't smile, but he understood. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel powerful. He felt responsible. The M2 wasn't just his weapon anymore. It was his voice in the chaos, his only real chance of keeping Jimmy and himself alive. Across the desert, Franz Klein sat in his own foxhole, scribbling notes into a leather-bound field journal. His handwriting was tight, precise. New American weapon, possibly heavy machine gun, single operator, very heavy rounds. Shreds sandbags, destroys cover, morale impact, high. Strategy, avoid direct engagement. Flank, use snipers, artillery, never head on. Code name, unofficial, Schwarzer Hammer, Black Hammer. Operator, young, calm, effective, will prioritize elimination. He closed the notebook. The war had shifted, and both men, Bill Morgan and Franz Klein, had seen each other across that dust-choked battlefield, even if only for a second. It wouldn't be the last time. They hit the beach just after dawn. The sky over Normandy was the color of ash, and the sea churned like something angry, slamming into the hulls of landing craft with sickening rhythm. June 6th, 1000, 944 D-Day, and the largest amphibious assault in history, had begun with a prayer, a scream, and the metallic clatter of men loading weapons they hoped they'd live long enough to fire. Bill Morgan stood near the bow of his Higgins boat, hand gripping the M2's handles, boots slick with salt water and vomit. Jimmy was beside him, feeding in a fresh belt, his hands trembling despite the weeks of rehearsals. They had trained for this, but the bullets tearing through the morning air hadn't read the playbook. The surf ahead was dotted with bodies, some floating, some face down, some crawling over the dead to reach the sand. Mortar shells burst like thunderclaps, machine guns stitched the water with invisible fangs. And above it all, the German bunkers on the bluffs rained lead like it was rain from God himself. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted. Jimmy glanced at Bill. Still think Ma Deuce has our back? Bill didn't answer. He just racked the charging handle. The metal clunk was swallowed by the chaos outside. The ramp dropped, and hell opened. Bill squeezed the triggers, and the M2 roared to life. Mounted on a pintle atop the boat's gun shield, it kicked back with every shot, sending deep, chest-pounding thuds across the water. The barrel glowed. The shells clattered to the deck in piles of fire-hot brass. He aimed high at the bunkers, trying to suppress, trying to buy seconds for the men charging the surf. Tracers arced upward, smashing into concrete, steel, and men. He saw sparks, smoke. Then a sudden crack, something slammed into the shield near his head. "Reload!" he shouted. Jimmy ducked, yanked a new belt from the ammo tin, his fingers moving fast, too fast. A round whined past his shoulder, then another. And then he fell. There was no scream, no drama. Just a flash of red and the way his body folded, like a puppet with the strings cut. "Jimmy!" Bill dropped low, grabbing his friend, dragging him behind the thin armor plate. Blood pooled fast, too fast. Jimmy's mouth moved. No sound came out. His hand twitched toward the M2, still running dry. Bill didn't hesitate. He pulled the belt from Jimmy's hand, slammed it into the receiver, and stood up. He became the weapon. The Ma Deuce barked again, louder now, angrier. Each shot a fist to the chest of the enemy. He swept the bunkers, carved fire into every slit and crevice. Sandbags shredded. A gun port exploded in flame. A man fell screaming from a nest above the beach. It didn't matter that the water reached his knees. It didn't matter that his best friend lay dying beneath him. The only thing that mattered was keeping the others alive. Around him, more boats landed. More men charged forward. Some didn't make it past the surf, but those who did so under the cover of his fire. It wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. It was war in its rawest form, loud, dirty, furious. By the time the order came to disembark, Bill had fired nearly 300 rounds. The barrel steamed. His gloves were burnt at the knuckles. His face was blank. Jimmy was gone. They buried him on the bluff 2 days later, a white cross, one of thousands. No ceremony, just a name, a number, and a space in the dirt overlooking the same beach where he had fallen. Bill didn't speak at the burial. He didn't cry. He just placed a .50 caliber casing at the base of the cross and walked away. That night, as the wind howled across the shattered beachhead, Bill sat alone with the M2, cleaning it by touch, not by sight. His hands moved automatically. Barrel off, feed tray open, wipe. Oil, reassemble. A sergeant approached. "You did good work, son." Bill didn't look up. "She didn't stop," he said softly. "Who?" Bill patted the gun. "She never stopped." Far above, on the bluff where the German defenses once stood, Franz Klein watched the Allied advance from a distance. He had arrived too late to command the defense, but in time to see the aftermath. Bunkers shattered, men burned alive inside, machine gun positions torn apart like paper. He walked the ruins in silence. One position still had the gun intact, a blackened MG-42 melted to its mount. Inside the pillbox, he found a soldier's body curled beside a broken ammo belt, the headless corpse still holding the trigger. Klein turned toward the beach. He could still hear the thunder, the low, steady rhythm that had shattered their line like glass. He knew it now. The American gun. Not a rumor, not a myth. A reaper. That night, in his field journal, Klein wrote, "New phase of war. Psychological dominance through firepower. M2 Browning, centerpiece of assault. Enemy gunner. Relentless, disciplined, effective. Losses, unacceptable. Response, shift tactics. Eliminate heavy gunners with sniper and indirect fire. We cannot match this gun. We must silence it." And far below the cliffs, under a moonless sky, Bill Morgan didn't sleep. He sat with the gun that had spared him and cost him everything. In his lap, a photo of Jimmy creased, blood-stained, taken back at camp. Both of them smiling. Young, clean. It felt like a different war. A different life. He whispered to the wind. "I'm still here, Jimmy." But the beach had no answer. Only the distant sound of waves, washing the blood from the sand. The trees in Normandy whispered death. Unlike the beaches, where everything had been chaos and noise, the forest was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made veterans grip their rifles tighter and rookies forget to breathe. After the success of the D-Day landings, Bill Morgan's unit was pushing through the bocage country, a labyrinth of hedgerows, narrow lanes, and ancient woods where every bush could hide a rifle, every shadow a sniper. Bill rode on top of a Sherman, the M2 Browning mounted beside him, swaying gently as the tank rolled over uneven terrain. The Ma Deuce had been cleaned, re-barreled, re-fed. But something had changed. Jimmy wasn't there. The seat beside him was empty. No one cracked jokes, no one hummed off-key country songs. And the gun felt heavier than ever. They were halfway through a narrow trail, walls of green on either side when the ambush hit. It started with a whistle. Then an explosion, a German anti-tank mine, buried beneath the dirt road, detonated under the lead tank. The Sherman in front of Bill's vehicle erupted, turret flipping like a coin. Flames belched into the sky. Then the forest came alive. MG-42S opened up from the trees. Bullets snapped and hissed past Bill's ears. A mortar thumped in the distance, followed by the sharp crack of trees splitting. "Cover! Down! Down!" someone yelled. Bill grabbed the handles of the M2 and swung it toward the tree line, but before he could fire, a burst of enemy fire slammed into the receiver. Sparks flew. Something snapped. The charging handle jammed halfway back. Smoke poured from the breach. The Ma Deuce was down. He tried to clear it, yanked the cover, yanked the belt, but it was no use. A round had pierced the side housing, cracking the feed tray. "Morgan, get off the tank." Too late. Another explosion lifted him off his feet. He hit the dirt hard, back slamming against a stump. His helmet rolled away. His ears rang. The world tilted and blurred. Somewhere, the tank behind him was on fire. He reached for the M2, but it wasn't there. Just twisted metal. Just silence. When Bill came to, it was dusk. He crawled through the underbrush, pain knifing through his ribs. His uniform was torn. Blood soaked his side. But worse than the wound was the emptiness above him. His mount was gone. His gun was gone. For the first time since Tunisia, Bill was alone and unarmed. The forest was full of shadows. Somewhere in the distance, Germans shouted to one another in clipped, urgent voices. Bill pressed himself flat beneath a fallen log, trying to slow his breathing. He heard boots. Crunching leaves. 2 soldiers, rifles slung, scanning the wreckage. One of them had a field cap and officer's insignia. Sharp eyes, cold expression. Franz Klein. Klein approached the broken tank carefully. He kicked at the M2's remains with the toe of his boot. So, this was the weapon that had haunted him since Africa. It looked mortal now. "Not so loud today, are you?" he muttered, almost to himself. Then he noticed something, a fresh blood trail in the dirt, leading away from the wreck. He followed it slowly, methodically, rifle lowered but ready. Bill watched from behind a fallen oak. He could see the man now, German, mid-30s, calm, too calm. Not some green recruit. This one was experienced. And closing in, he reached for his sidearm, but it was gone. No gun, no grenades, no Modus. Just a branch in his hand and the taste of blood in his mouth. Then voices. French. A shout, a dog barking. The German paused, turned his head slightly. That was all Bill needed. He bolted low and fast through the trees, toward the sound, toward something, anything that wasn't enemy fire. A cottage, half hidden by vines, barely more than a barn, but lit from inside. Bill collapsed at the door. A woman screamed. Then strong arms lifted him, shouting. Darkness. He woke on a straw mattress, ribs bandaged, shirt off, smelling smoke and soup. A little girl sat beside him with a doll. A man stirred a pot over a wood-burning stove. The woman who had screamed now looked at him with cautious eyes, but not fear. They had saved him. And when he tried to speak, to thank them, no words came out. Only silence. Outside, somewhere deeper in the woods, Franz Klein stood where the blood trail ended. He knelt, touched the dirt. Faint footprints, then nothing. Gone. The American had escaped, but not with his weapon. That was something. Inside the cottage, Bill sat up, wincing. Through the window, he could see a fog settling over the field beyond. For the first time since Tunisia, he felt naked. Not because of the wound, not because of the blood, but because he no longer had the gun that had been his voice, his shield, his partner. He stared at his hands. And for the first time in the war, they trembled. The first time Bill touched the M2 again, his hands hesitated. It had been 3 weeks since the ambush in Normandy. His ribs still ached. The scars hadn't faded, but his unit needed men, and he wasn't about to sit out the rest of the war in a field hospital. So they gave him a new mount, a new vehicle, a new gun. It was an air-cooled M2 with a heavy barrel, freshly issued, mounted on the turret of an armored half-track. The charging handle was stiff, the steel still slick from the factory, not a scratch on it. Bill stared at it for a long time before he climbed into the turret. His gloves creaked as he gripped the handles, and the silence inside him shifted. The offensive was moving fast now. After breaking through the hedgerows, American forces surged towards St. Lo, smashing pockets of resistance with tanks, artillery, and relentless infantry assaults. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of diesel. That morning, Bill's convoy was pushing through a bombed-out village, stone walls collapsed, shutters hanging loose when the sky screamed. A Stuka. The distinct whine of its dive siren pierced the air as it fell from the clouds like a dagger. The half-track driver shouted, "Stuka! 2 o'clock high!" The 20mm cannons beneath its wings flashed. Bill swung the M2 upward. He didn't think, didn't aim. He let instinct take the shot. The gun erupted, barrel leaping, brass flying. Tracers cut a path through the smoke. The roar of the .50 filled the street like thunder rolling through a canyon. 3 rounds tore through the Stuka's fuselage. The engine caught fire. And then, just like that, it spiraled downward and slammed into a field behind the ruins. No cheers. Just stunned silence. Then a voice from below. "Holy hell, gunner, you clipped a damn Stuka." Bill didn't reply. He just adjusted the barrel. The gun was alive again. Later that day, they rolled into a defensive line near Coutances, dug in for the night but wary of German armor pushing from the south. Scouts reported movement, half-tracks and light tanks, probing the perimeter. They were coming. Bill waited in the turret, eyes locked on the tree line. Then a flash. Enemy armor emerged through the orchard. Visual on armor, fire at will. The M2 opened up. Not a machine gun, not anymore. A scalpel, a hammer, a voice of judgment. He aimed for the tread's snap. Sparks. The tank shuddered. He shifted, boom. The optics blew apart in a burst of glass. Another vehicle swerved, panicked. Bill tracked it, led the shot, and ripped through the engine grill. The vehicle burst into flame, black smoke twisting into the air. The line held. And by dawn, the orchard was silent. Franz Klein arrived after the retreat. His men had been cut to ribbons, not by artillery, not by tank shells, but by that unmistakable American .50. He knew the signature. He saw the impact points, the way the bullets had torn through armor plates, gouged deep into steel, shattered control panels. He ran his fingers along one of the holes. Clean, precise, devastating. "She's back," he whispered. "The Black Hammer is back." The next day, fate moved the pieces closer. Bill's unit was clearing a farmhouse complex on the outskirts of Avranches. They took fire from the barn, German stragglers holding the high ground. A stubborn pocket, well defended. Bill set up the M2 behind a crumbled stone wall, elevated just enough to cover the second-story windows. Return fire was heavy. Bullets cracked overhead. The wall chipped and crumbled under the barrage. He waited. Then, movement in the window. He fired. A short, controlled burst. The window exploded inward. Silence. Then a scream. A man stumbled out the front door, hands raised. And behind him, Klein, covered in dust, jacket torn, pistol in hand but not raised. They locked eyes. Bill's finger hovered on the trigger. He could end it. The man who had stalked his gun, who had studied him, hunted him, called him a threat. The man responsible for Jimmy's death? Maybe. But the man now stood alone, no weapon raised, just waiting. Time bent. Bill remembered the beach. The fire. The silence after Jimmy stopped breathing. He remembered crawling through the dirt without his weapon, powerless, small. He thought about the gun beneath his hands now, and what it meant to pull the trigger. He didn't. He lifted his hand and waved the man away. "Go," he whispered, though the German wouldn't hear it. Klein stared at him, frozen, then nodded once, and vanished into the smoke. Later, when the battle was done, a young private asked Bill why he hadn't shot. Bill just looked at his hands. "Because," he said slowly, "not every shot has to be fired." And behind him, the M2 sat silent once more, still smoking, but at peace. The war ended, but not for everyone. Bill Morgan stepped off the transport ship in New York Harbor in the fall of 1945, duffel bag over his shoulder, uniform wrinkled, boots worn to the sole. The city roared with celebration flags waving, music playing, kisses stolen under confetti skies. But Bill didn't smile. Not because he wasn't glad to be home, but because part of him had never left that battlefield. Part of him was still in Normandy, on a beach soaked in blood, on a tank turret in Tunisia, behind a sandbag wall in St. Lo. The part with the gun. He took a train south to North Carolina. His family greeted him with cautious joy, his mother with tears, his father with a firm handshake that lingered too long. They cooked his favorite meal. They washed his uniform. But no one asked what he had seen. No one asked what it felt like to be the man behind the Maudus. A week later, Bill made a quiet trip to the coast. Arlington Cemetery. Row after row of white crosses stretched before him, perfect and identical, like soldiers standing eternal guard. But he found the one he was looking for without a map. James Jimmy Wells. The name was etched clean. Below it, June 6th, 1944. Bill stood there for a long time. He didn't speak, didn't kneel. He just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something he had carried since Normandy, a crumpled photograph of the two of them back at camp. Jimmy, smiling. Bill, pretending not to. He placed it gently at the base of the cross. And beside it, a single .50 caliber casing, polished, quiet. A few days later, he visited Jimmy's mother. The house was small, white, flowers in the window. She opened the door slowly, aged more than time should allow. "Mrs. Wells," he said, removing his cap. Her eyes welled up the moment she saw him. She didn't ask how Jimmy died. She only asked if he had suffered. Bill shook his head. "No, ma'am, he was fast. He didn't know." She pressed a hand to her lips. "He always talked about you in his letters." Bill reached into his satchel and handed her an envelope one Jimmy had written the night before D-Day, but never mailed. She clutched it like scripture. They sat on the porch and watched the sunset. No words, just presence. That night, Bill couldn't sleep. He sat at his father's workbench, hands trembling not from pain but memory, the weight of command, the weight of survival. The M2 had been a tool, a protector, but it had also been the sharp edge of everything he'd lost, every friend buried, every enemy silenced. Every time he pulled the trigger and felt less human afterward. He picked up a pen and paper and began to write. Not to Jimmy, but to Franz Klein. To the soldier I didn't kill. I don't know your name. I don't know if you lived through the rest of the war. I don't know if you still hear the sound of my gun, like I do in my sleep. But I remember you. I remember how you looked at me, not with fear, but with something else. Understanding, maybe. Resignation. I didn't shoot, not because I was merciful, but because I was tired. Tired of deciding who lives and who doesn't. Tired of being the hammer. That day, I chose silence. I don't know what that means to you. I just hope you used it well. I hope you found peace. I'm still looking for mine. He never mailed it. He folded the letter and placed it into an old ammo box, now filled with keepsakes, dog tags, patches, a cracked set of binoculars, a scorched photo of Jimmy, and a bent, .50 caliber round from Tunisia. His war was over. But its echoes remained. Every year after that, on June 6th, Bill would visit Jimmy's grave. He never brought flowers. Just another casing. Just another piece of what he carried. In the end, some men return whole. Some return broken. And some return with stories they'll never tell. But Bill? He returned with the silence between the shots. And sometimes that silence says more than thunder ever could. The museum hadn't changed. Same polished floors, same still air, same display case holding the M2 Browning, barrel angled slightly upward, as if it could still see the battlefield. Bill Morgan stood in front of it again, older now, slower. The weight on his shoulders wasn't from years, it was from memory. A young boy passed behind him with his father, pointing to the gun. Look, Dad, that's the one they called the meat chopper. The father nodded, distracted. .50 caliber, big gun, killed a lot of bad guys. Bill didn't turn. Because it wasn't just a weapon to him. It was a voice. A partner. A burden. Footsteps approached from the left. Slow. Deliberate. Bill didn't need to look. He recognized the gait. Franz Klein. Time had softened his face, added weight to his steps, but the eyes were the same clear, calculating, and human. They stood shoulder to shoulder, neither speaking. In front of them, a weapon that had once connected them in violence. And now, in silence. Bill finally turned. Klein looked at him. Not as enemies. Not even as soldiers. But as two men who had survived the same storm. They exchanged a single nod. And that was enough. Later, Bill wandered into the museum's memorial wing. Rows of plaques, photos, a wall etched with names. He found Jimmy's. Same grin, same hat tilted too far back. A kid, really. Below it, killed in action, June 6th, 1944, Omaha Beach. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a casing, polished, heavy. He placed it gently beneath the frame, then turned to leave. Outside, the sky was gray, not from clouds, but from autumn. Bill sat on a bench beneath a rustling oak tree. His hand brushed the wooden armrest, feeling the grain like he once felt the ridges of the M2's charging handle. Nearby, school children laughed. Across the courtyard, Klein exited the museum alone. They didn't wave. They didn't need to. Sometimes peace isn't forged in words or treaties. Sometimes it's just the absence of fire. Bill tilted his head toward the sky. The wind was strong today. It made the leaves tremble, almost like thunder. Weapons don't choose who they protect. They don't weep for the ones they kill. But the men who carry them, they remember. They carry the echoes. Long after the war is over, long after the last shot is fired. He stood up slowly. One last look at the museum. Then he walked away. not from the past, but toward whatever peace the future still offered.